Welcome to History Now. My name is Barry Sheppard, and today's show we'll be discussing 1930s Belfast and issues of identity. Joining me today are Philip Orr, a writer interested in issues of identity and public history, and alongside him is Seán Mitchell. Seán is the author of two books, one, Struggle or Starve, on the 1932 outdoor relief riots, and The Rebel's Guide to Connolly. You're both very welcome. So how important do you think the opening of Stormont was in projecting a certain identity in terms of where it was located, who built it, who was in charge of it, and what was inside it?
Well, the Northern Parliament had initially been meeting both in the City Hall and then subsequently in the Presbyterian Seminary, basically. And meanwhile, in the late 1920s, the building of Stormont began, and it's located not in the city centre as in those two previous venues, but in East Belfast. And it's on a hilltop location, the Stormont estate, looking very grandly down over the Lagan Valley, down over the city of Belfast. The architect has already been putting his signature on Liverpool. He's built a lot of very fine civic buildings on the waterfront in Liverpool and around that city. He's given the task of building Stormont, and he does so in a very, very grand way. You could be forgiven even today for looking at Stormont and thinking, you know, you could govern a subcontinent from this. It's huge and it's grand. But what we have to remember too is that initially the idea was to have two other buildings there, not just the parliamentary structure, but an administrative block and also then legal buildings. And that was abandoned. And I suppose the context for that is, I mean, the building of the Stormont edifice begins in the late 20s, just at the time when Depression happens in America and the economy nosedives around the world, and poverty starts to hit in Belfast and across Ireland, across the British Isles. And so that's a context perhaps for clipping the wings of the project. But still, I mean, I think it's an immensely important building to solidify the sense of this new Northern identity. And of course, just about that time, the statue of Carson goes up. It doesn't go up exactly at the time of the opening, but something between 30 and 40,000 people probably were there for the initiation of that statue of Stormont. The sculptor is a man with a tradition of building monumental stuff. And there is Carson, you know, standing there in oratorical pose, whereas Craig, who's later buried on site when he dies during the First World War, is tucked away in a much more mundane location beside the building. But there's Carson, who had been, of course, the great barrister and orator. And it's a throwback or a deliberate reminder, I think, of those great days in the Unionist project pre-war, when Carson is on the Carson Trail, and Craig has brought him over brought him up from Dublin to speak with eloquence, which he does, and it's part of the charisma of that whole pre-war period.
And it's one of a number of buildings that are, you know, the late 20s going into the 30s. Another one of them would be the cenotaph at City Hall. Part of that design is the Egyptian pillars, and would that be another sort of connection to the empire at that point?
Yes, and what's interesting about it for me is if you look at some of the statuary that is beside it, for example, the Marquis of Dufferin and Ava, a statue to him, the great empire builder, famous in Burma, in Canada, in India. It's situated right beside that, and right beside the City Hall, which of course is in many ways a sacred building to Unionists, because the Covenant, certainly the most important signatories of the Covenant met in City Hall in 1912, September the 28th. So that cenotaph going up is a very important moment, but there are other buildings. You know, the Ulster Museum is completed eventually in 1929. There's a range of buildings that emerge at that time, which I think, as you said earlier, start to give a presence, in a sense, a cultural sense, a commemorative sense, a governance sense of what Northern Ireland is.
On the subject of Stormont, as Philip has mentioned, it's situated on a hill overlooking Belfast, and so the whole of Belfast would have seen it being built. So how, in your research, have you come across how this was viewed by working class communities around Belfast who, as Philip has mentioned, it was right at the beginning of the Depression, and who were struggling to make ends meet. How did they view this enormous monument to unionism going?
Well, I think, as you said, and as Philip said before you, Stormont is built and indeed opens during an intense, very harsh period of poverty, what was known as the Hungry 30s. I mean, you're talking about a period here where somewhere in the region of 100,000 people are unemployed, perhaps 40% of the city of Belfast. And that kind of unemployment and the life for the unemployed was a particularly abject form of poverty. You're talking about when people were unemployed, they had to either go through a very short period of insurance if they had the fortune of being in employment previous, and then thereafter into the poor laws, into either the indoor relief inside the workhouse that few took, or outdoor relief performing menial and often backbreaking tasks for a bare pittance. So in the midst of all this desperate poverty, here you have a building being built with all its opulence, and as you say, perched on top of a hill. And though it was in East Belfast, it was removed from the main areas of the population, which was significant, I think, in itself. So it gave off this impression of, a governance on the top of a hill, separate from the rest of the population and looking down upon them, with all the, as I say, extravagance and the money that went into it. And it can't be said that it was universally held that this was a bad thing. When it was opened, tens of thousands of people came out. But I think it did lend credence to the development of a sort of class antagonism in the city, a sense of identity in the sense that there was not only just Catholics and Protestants, but the haves and have-nots in the city. And when the great unemployed movement of the 1930s emerges, particularly in 1932, with all its extraordinary force, you see in a number of occasions reference being made, particularly by the leaders of the outdoor relief campaign, to the building of Stormont, and particularly the money that was involved in it. And I think that was because at the time the Unionist government was pleading poverty. They themselves were saying, we are cash strapped, we don't have the money to put on new employment schemes, we do not have the money to increase rates of relief. So the Stormont acted in a way, I think, to almost sharpen that class divide in a very visual way for a lot of people that here there was millions of pounds being built on this building, and yet people couldn't even get a decent meal.
Yeah, and it's not just the building of Stormont. There were references made to the lifestyle of James Craig. I know one of the outdoor relief leaders made a speech later on in the 1930s and saying about young men starving here while James Craig swans off around the Mediterranean.
Well, on innumerable occasions in the speeches of the unemployed leaders, particularly by those who came from a communist background in the revolutionary workers' groups, there were constant references made to the lifestyle not only of Craig, but also of individuals such as Dawson Bates, who in the main, in the government itself, were top industrialists, very wealthy individuals themselves, and people who didn't feel the full impact of the Great Depression. I mean, the Great Depression was universal for the vast majority of the population, but certainly not for everyone. And Craig and his ilk were able to escape the worst of it. So, again, it's not only the Stormont, but just their lifestyle and the fact that their profit and their wealth hasn't seemed to have taken an impact in the slightest. I mean, in this period, Dawson Bates had a train that was put on by GNR just for him in order to get into Belfast. So these things were constantly referenced as a way to concretely highlight to people in the city, listen, yes, there's a divide between Catholics and Protestants, but isn't there a bigger divide between those on the top of the hill, or who were to be situated on the top of the hill, and those in the working class estates of Belfast? In
your book, I was very surprised to read that when the poor laws came in and the poor house came in the 1830s, right through to the 1930s and the time you've researched, there wasn't that much change in terms of facilities on offer for relief or ways of administering relief. Do you think that was, in a way, trying to hang on to a Victorian identity. Because I know in the South and in Britain in the mid-1920s, they abolished the poor laws as it was, whereas here they kept it on. Do you think that was a way of hanging on to a Victorian identity or imposing that identity on poor people?
Well, I think that it would be much too kind to Craigavon and Dawson Bates and the Unionist government of the time to suggest that the persistence of the poor laws was down to an affinity with a Victorian identity. I think there were much more baseline economic and selfish reasons, frankly, as to why the poor laws persisted in the way that they did. And I think there's probably two main reasons that they persist. One is, as I said, the Unionist government, not wholly unique to Europe, but I think in a very concentrated form, was very much an executive committee for the very wealthiest of Northern Irish society. And I think it was in their interest to maintain a system that is often described as an early form of welfare reform, but in reality is a form of social control upon people. You get to choose who gets relief, who doesn't get relief, where they go, how much they get, and so on. I think it was very much in the interest of that government to maintain that system. But also, I think conversely, the Unionist government was faced with a very divided labour movement in a way that the government in London wasn't. And I think they were able to get away with a lot more than governments elsewhere would have, had there been the similar style of united trade union movement, or at least more united than it had been throughout the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, the 1920s is a very barren period for the labour movement and the whole post-partition period is a very barren period for labourism generally. And I think that opened up a space really for all manner of anti-working class policy to be enacted. I mean, if there's no one going to oppose you and you can get away with it, you will find invariably that governments will do such things. So I would think certainly that is the main reason that the poor laws persisted, not precisely in the way that they did in the 19th century, but that many elements of them did.
Philip, just on the topic of buildings and identity, there's some very interesting things going on outside of Belfast, and I know you've researched on the 1911-1914 in Antrim, and particularly the house the Larne gun running took place from. Now, in the time where a unionist identity is being imposed on official buildings, this house, which is so important, the unionist lore, actually ends up in the hands of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. The Drumalis house had belonged to the Smiley family, and in 1914, on April 9th, that the gun running happens, it's basically organised. The logistics of it in the port of Larne are organised from there. So it's an iconic building, and one that Carson visited. There were Ulster Volunteer Force displays there and so on. But the family didn't have any descendants to maintain the building. The family more or less emigrated to Scotland, where they originated from. The building went up for sale and eventually ended up by the early 1930s in the hands of the Cross and Passion Order. It became a convent. It became, eventually, nowadays, a retreat centre belonging to the Catholic Church. In the case, for example, of Drumalis, there's knowledge that there had been a monastery there back in earlier years. And a very strong sense of that in the Catholic tradition that reacquaints itself and takes over that building. But then again, it's not the only battle that's happening for cultural space, because one of the most interesting examples for me is when you go down in the area around Saul, near Downpatrick, which of course is sacred territory in terms of the story of Patrick arriving up the River Coyle back at the beginnings of Irish Christendom. And in the early 1930s, up goes a big statue, I think it's 1932-33, of St. Patrick on a mountain or a hill called Sleeporrick. And this, it's no coincidence, I think, that it's the time of the Ecumenical Congress. You know, it's a time when there's a surge of expressing Catholic identity, and of course it's connected to all kinds of sectarian tensions as well on the streets. But at the same time, in 1932, just meters, yards down from the hill where the statue goes up, the little Anglican church, the Church of Ireland at that Saul, is also rebuilt with a little round tower. So, although nowadays, I mean, if you go to the Saul Church, the little Church of Ireland church, is a centre for reconciliation and a very, very positive and worthwhile and very beautiful, very mystical place. You can't neglect the reality that this heritage of Christian identity is being tugged at. You know, is this a Celtic thing that ultimately leads to or connects to an Irish resurgence, a national resurgence? Or can you, as Unionists, as Protestants, which undoubtedly are the tags we would put to the people who were building that church, can they claim that inheritance as well? Is that part of the identity? So I think these are very interesting little moments. And that statue's gone up in 1932-33 at Slieve Party at the same time as the Carson statue's gone up in the grounds of the Stormont Estate. So there's more work to be done. I don't feel I have sufficient knowledge. I would love to see more work being done on the way in which geographical spaces and cultural emblems, statues, houses, you know, become very, very important.
Yeah, and just leading on from, you said about in 1932, the Eucharistic Congress. Now, the Eucharistic Congress led to widespread disorder around Belfast and other places like Lurgan, Portadown. Pretty much the same streets that only a matter of months later, people who could have been on opposing sides of unrest around the Eucharistic Congress in June 1932 were coming together only a short matter of months later. Was there any sense of acknowledgement of that when people started to come together in the outdoor relief movement?
Well, that's the fascinating juxtaposition of 1932. It's the riots around the Eucharistic Congress that summer and the working class unity, if you will, of weeks actually in terms of the movement developing and some of the small scale protests, and then months before the wider scale protests emerge. And it's a fascinating question to think of. I mean, I think many of the riots that occur around the Eucharistic Congress weren't simply spontaneous. There had been a sort of build-up before it. The various Orange lodges had passed resolutions against the fact that Belfast City councillors were allowed to attend the Eucharistic Congress in their robes as aldermen, and there had been a build-up of meetings organised by a loyalist group known as the Ulster Protestant League in the run-up to it as well. So there was this development of tension, and I think again it would be crude to put it that one was a sort of a clash of identity of cultures, and then the next is a clash of class. Because I think in some ways, some of the clashes of culture in and around the Eucharistic Congress, and then later on in a much bigger way in 1935 in riots of that year, often themselves also have a basis in class anger. I mean, there is a development at the time, an argument on one side that perhaps Protestants are not doing so well because the government had gone soft on Catholics. There is, of course, conversely an argument that Catholics shouldn't have any truck throwing their lot in with Protestants. Why bother? And I think often a lot of the sectarianism that developed in this period had its origins in class, even if it didn't express itself in a class basis. And again, even on the unemployed campaigns themselves, some of the early demonstrations, particularly in 1931, were small and indeed set upon by sectarian forces. So I think, sometimes when the story's told, it's crudely separated. As I said, you have the cultural expression or sectarian expression, and then you have the more positive or class expression. I think there is a more complex mix of all of these factors, and the particular direction that it goes is down to all sorts of different factors. So I and again in the run up to the 35 riots, there was a big dispute over the fact that a Catholic organisation was allowed to use Ulster Hall. And this was used by some of the loyalist groups to say, again, look, Unionist government is becoming soft on Catholics. So again, I think all these things intermix.
In recent years, examples of the likes of the outdoor relief movement and a couple of generations before, the 1907 dockers' strike, are held up as examples that we in contemporary society should admire in the way it celebrates cross-community endeavour, if that's the correct term. Is that somewhat missing the point? Should the outdoor relief riots and lockout really be held up as an example of trying to establish a worker's identity outside the narrow confines of Catholic and Protestant, Unionist and Nationalist?
Well, I don't know that it misses the point. I would say that they should be celebrated. I mean, we don't have that many events of that sort of cross-community nature to celebrate. So I do think that there is a rationale in holding them up and celebrating them. But I do think that they should be celebrated, or at least discussed, warts and all. Because you have this great period of unity in the 1907 dockers' strike led by Jim Larkin. You have indeed after that the 1919 general strike, a fantastic period of labour strife of unity between people, and indeed the 1932 riots. But each one of these events is then followed by an intense period of sectarianism. Into 1912 after the dockers' strike, obviously in and around the period of partition after the general strike of 1919 and the riots, quite severe riots of 1935 and the years after the outdoor relief movement. So I think that there can be a tendency sometimes to have a sort of starry-eyed mythology of these moments, and I don't know that serves us a particularly useful purpose when we try and grapple with the very deep questions of how questions of class relate to questions of national affiliation.
Thank you. And is there anything you'd like to add, Philip?
Yeah, I think Seán's right that we shouldn't be starry-eyed in our approach to this period. But I think it's interesting to take an example or two of a personal kind. The person who interests me in 1932 in many ways is Charlotte Despard, who is one of the great feminists, one of the great fascinating figures from the suffragette period. And Charlotte Despard, in her 80s, comes north to Belfast to live because she has basically been burned out of her house in Dublin by mobs who were attacking her because, although she was an attending Catholic, she was seen as a Bolshevik. She'd been to the Soviet Union. She was on the Republican side of the Civil War. She comes north. Where does she go to live? She lives in a house opposite the gates of Stormont, with two RUC men, it said, guarding her because she was attending workers, RWG groups, Revolutionary Workers groups, meetings, But then she moves from there up to a house in North Belfast. But when she moved to North Belfast, she was attacked by a Unionist mob. So in Dublin, she'd been attacked by a Catholic mob, by a Protestant mob in Belfast. And then she moves to the quieter realm of Whitehead, where she dies aged 95 in 1939. But what is interesting to me is you could locate lots of other people in that period who suffer the same way. Members of the Labour Party, for example, like Harry Midgley, who on the one hand are attacked by the Orange side because of what he's standing for in a party that at one stage at least held people who were very ambivalent and had all kinds of views on partition. On the other hand, when he takes a stand against Franco and against the Spanish Civil War, which he ardently does, he gets attacked from those inside the Catholic fraternity who would have been pro-Franco. So the lesson is, if you're going to take those kind of stance in the Northern Ireland of this period, you may pay for it.
And it sort of leads me on to my next question quite well. In the previous interview you did with Jacobin magazine, you've stated that there's a lack of labour history that covers the North. And there's a tendency to look through the prism of sectarianism. Do you think this fascination with two tribes has unfairly squeezed out a lot of history? It leads on from what Philip says, so kind of, I think I know the answer, but what's your view on that?
Well, I think the main reason, firstly, that there's a dearth in labour history is probably because there's far more emphasis placed on the Troubles. There's a certain way that we often look back on history through the sort of goggles of today, and to the extent to which we often view history purely through the dynamics of the Troubles. And often I think that leads to a presumption that that identities, if you will, are far more static, that political affiliations are far more static than I think they actually were. I think things were much more fluid in many other periods than they were during the Troubles. The interchange of communities, the interchange of individuals from different religions into different political persuasions. But I also think it's partly to do with the fact that there was a rise in the academy of what has been described as a revisionist tendency. And again, that was was to do with, I think, the intensity of the ideological debates during the Troubles. And I think that labour history was collateral damage in that ideological debate. So I think now is a period, though, I think we're beginning to see the re-emergence of scholars, not always within the academy, often outside of it, who are looking at not just labour history, but some of the more unique aspects of our past that have been ignored, and that might possibly pull out some new threads, in terms of things that have been ignored in the past. My own book on 1932, I think, was a small contribution to that.
And leading on from that, Philip, some of the research that you've done on the aforementioned Lauren gun running, there were a lot of people in Antrim and North Antrim who didn't fit neatly into the two tribes, if for want of a better term. James Brown Armour, people like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the period you're referring to would be the period from 1911 to 14. But if you look at the period 1911, 1912, there are strikes going on in the heart of Ballymena. Some of the big mills, for example, the Braidwater Mill, closed down for a couple of weeks because the women are out walking the streets, calling for improved conditions. There's strikes in the paper mills down in Ballyclare. So that has all gone by the way, and we think of the period 1911, 12, 13, 14 politically, and with a big P, but not in a sense of what's going on there. But might I mention, also just to complete, that our story of working class history is impoverished. The story of what's going on. I'll give you a wee example in East Belfast, which I've been studying recently and doing a bit of work on. In East Belfast, nobody remembers the fact there were two shipyards there. Everybody talks about Harlot and Wolff. In 1935, another shipyard called Workman Clark closed down. 1935, a key year. And at one stage, various stages, it was actually producing more tonnage than the Harlot and Wolff. There's a famous incident where a riveter there created a world record for the number of rivets he put into the side of a ship in one day. The amazing way in which we wipe out those stories and need to reclaim them about labour, about work, both as men and women, is terribly important. I mean, even just the history of Labour Party as well. I mean, people forget that in East Belfast, seen as a unionist citadel, I mean, David Blakely won 40% of the vote way back, in the era just before the Troubles. Now, you may question the Labour Party as a vehicle of the left if you come from, a left position, a strong left position. But nonetheless, you know what I'm saying? There's a way in which we flatten stories and don't tell them with all the intricacy that they deserve.
Yeah, and there's just one final point, is the North Antrim home rulers, who were Protestant home rulers, their descendants. I'm thinking of William Staveley Armour, the founder of the Young Farmers Clubs of Ulster. He operated a cross-community and cross-border policy in the 1930s, and I think people like that are also being written out, and we sort of need to reclaim that part of our past. And we've run out of time, so thanks very much, Seán, and thanks very much, Philip.